Comrades, compatriots and friends, good afternoon. Allow me to start by thanking the ANC National Youth Task Team on behalf of the ANC Youth League for the invitation to discuss the hard-won freedom of South African workers to organize and to reflect on the ANC's long-standing bond with organized labor. It is fitting that we should be having this discussion on Workers' Day, an important moment in our national calendar when we salute the achievement of workers and reaffirm our shared commitment to advance the cause of the working people of our country. We are having this discussion at an extremely difficult time for our country. The global coronavirus pandemic has caused great disruption in the lives of all South Africans, but has hurt the working class and the poor in our country particularly more. As we work towards going forward together to respond to this health emergency and to what has now become an economic crisis, it is more important than ever before that we draw on the bonds that exist between the ANC and the progressive labor movement as led by the Congress of South African Trade Unions. To understand those bonds and to appreciate their significance in our current circumstances, we need to reflect on the past. In this lecture, I will focus on three broad themes. Firstly, the significance and the development of the labor movement in our country. Secondly, the political and organizational relationship between the National Liberation Movement in South Africa and the trade union movement. Thirdly, I will reflect on the features of this relationship in the democratic South Africa today. Now, the evolution of the trade union movement in South Africa reflects the unique features of the colonial economy and later the apartheid economy. As Paulo Jordan and Sbu Ndebele explain in the book, The Historical Roots of the ANC, the discovery of diamonds in Kimberley in 1867 and gold in the Witwatersrand in 1888 led to a massive demand for labor and in a very direct manner led to the brutal and near destructive transformation of African societies into a mass labor force. The colonial government economic historical moment to foster the dispossession of black people of their land and compelling them to go and work on the mines was a moment that we need to reflect on. Black workers were brutally repressed. They worked under appalling conditions and less than their white counterparts, and any organized protests that they wanted to embark upon were brutally crushed with deadly force. The right of freedom of association was very limited during this time and did not extend to black workers in any meaningful way. The labor laws of the time allowed white workers to enjoy freedom of association. There were a few instances of overall class solidarity on the mines, but white workers identified themselves separately from the indigenous working class. The exploitation of African workers by colonial capital was therefore closely associated with the process of colonial dispossession, oppression, and subjugation. The construction of the South African industrial economy of the late 19th century and the early 20th century required that the political rights and the economic rights, as well as the economic means of indigenous people, be eliminated. It was in such circumstances that the Industrial Commercial Workers Union, or the ICU as it was called, emerged as a champion of African and colored workers. Led by the dynamic Clemens Kadali, the ICU was formed in 1919 among dock workers in the Cape, but soon became a nationwide movement representing workers across a number of sectors. Among the people who spearheaded the expansion of the ICU, particularly in Natal, KZN of today, was A.W.G. Champion, a dynamic and influential figure in both the labor movement and the ANC over many decades. Now, the success of the ICU, which at its peak had around 150,000 members, a figure that's unheard of in those days, was due in large measure to its focus on obtaining better working conditions and higher wages for its members. And wow, was it successful. It dealt with the basic material needs of workers at a time when other African formations, like the ANC, were generally preoccupied with petitioning the union government for political rights. And despite its success, the ICU became divided into factions. One faction supporting militant action, and the other faction advocating moderation. Hamba kancane. By the 1930s, the ICU was a generally reduced force, and it ultimately disintegrated, a great pity for the working people of our country. The ICU organized African and colored workers at a time when there was a growing fear amongst white workers that lower paid black workers threatened their jobs. This fear was one of the factors behind the 1922 Rand Rebellion, an armed uprising of white mine workers on the Witwatersrand in response to plans by mine owners to ease the color bar to promote cheap black labor. The rebellion of 1922 demonstrated in the most brutal manner how racial divisions in the workplace were far more powerful than any broader solidarity among South African working people. And so, the South African trade union movement remained racially divided, with black workers having to walk their own path, and white workers advancing their privileged interests through their recognized white unions. A pivotal moment in the history of black trade unions was the 1946 mine workers' strike, which was led by J.B. Marks, the president of the then recently established African Mine Workers Union. Tens of thousands of mine workers went on strike across the East and the West Rand demanding better pay, decent working conditions, and an end to the huge disparity between the wages that were paid to them as black workers and white workers. Rather than engage with the workers, mine owners and the government responded with violence, killing several workers and forcing striking workers back to work underground. Hundreds of workers were arrested. They were tried, imprisoned, and dismissed from work, and those who came from neighboring countries were deported. Leaders of African trade unions, the entire executive committee of the African Mine Workers Union, the whole central committee of the Communist Party, and local leaders of the ANC were arrested and charged with treason and sedition following that strike. Instead of being daunted by such severe repression, the strike encouraged black workers to organize and to fight for their rights. Courage and bravery of ordinary black workers was a characteristic that throughout the years defined the union movement in South Africa. The strike sent a clear signal of the potential strength of black trade unions as workers became more and more organized. It also demonstrated that it was through unity and determination that workers could make concerted efforts to change their conditions of employment and living. It was also a demonstration of the vital link between political organizations, including the ANC and the Communist Party, and trade unions. J.B. Marx was at the time a leading figure in the Communist Party and the African National Congress. It was through various manifestations that were led by workers and their heroic struggles that a new era of black trade union activity emerged, culminating in the formation of the South African Congress of Trade Unions, SACTU, in 1955. It was at the formation of SACTU that the relationship between the National Liberation Movement and the progressive trade union movement was cemented and solidified. It was the culmination of a process of intermittent cooperation, collaboration, and mutual influence that began with the ICU, which was formed in 1919, and the early ANC. While the ANC was formed by traditional leaders, clergy leaders, intellectuals, and professionals to resist political and economic marginalization of Africans, and it largely represented a black modern elite. It found common cause with the black workers organized under the banner of the ICU. The ANC and the ICU had similar values, promoting democracy, non-racialism, and a single nationhood, but also in terms of its objective being completely opposed to discrimination and apartheid. The ANC and the ICU had worked very closely together in the 20s and in a number of important working class militants. The militant leaders had emerged, leaders such as Ghana Makabeni, Johnny Gomas, James Laguma, had received political training and began to play significant roles in the ANC. The growth of the ICU during the 20s so impressed then ANC President Josiah Gumede that the ANC began to rethink how it looked at the world and itself and the South African society broadly. The ANC began to organize itself as a movement of ordinary working people. The ANC also began to understand that the organized strength of all the people would be the means to bring about their liberation. It is significant too that a later generation of ANC leaders was instrumental in the 1940s in the formation of the African Mine Workers Union. Leaders of the ANC and the Communist Party became actively involved in the development of trade unions in this period, and many union organizers became active in the ANC as well as in Communist Party structures. Thus, by the time SACTU was formed, a clear understanding had developed about the respective roles of these formations. Speaking at the SACTU conference in 1959, former ANC President Nkosi Albert Luthuli said, open quotes, "SACTU is the spear, ANC the shield. No worker is a good member of Congress unless he is also a trade unionist. No trade unionist is a good trade unionist unless he is also a member of Congress. Workers," he continued, "are oppressed by political action. They must take political action in reply." While the South African Congress of Trade Unions must thus pursue an independent policy in the interests of the workers, it must also participate unreservedly in the struggle to mobilize the people behind their demands as embodied in the Freedom Charter, and must cooperate with other organizations engaged in this struggle. Close quotes. It is this understanding that has defined the relationship between the National Liberation Movement and the labor movement ever since. And in this case, South Africa is very unique, and our history is very unique. The ANC and SACTU together initiated, they planned and organized many protests and strikes during the 1950s. SACTU played an important role in the international arena to highlight the plight of workers in South Africa and the apartheid regime's repressive actions. The ANC and SACTU recognized that oppression in South Africa happened on the basis of both race and class, and they began to appreciate that women in South Africa experience what we call triple oppression, based on their race, on their class, and on their gender. Workers joined unions not only to improve their wages and working conditions, but because unions were also engaged in a broader struggle for political freedom and social justice. For many black workers, joining a trade union was as much a political act as it was an economic one as well. Even as the liberation movements were banned and non-racial trade unionism was crushed, this tradition was sustained in exile and in the underground. After a decade of severe repression, it was the Durban dock workers who in 1973 inspired the spontaneous groundswell of strikes that resulted in the official legislative recognition of black unions under apartheid rule. The recognition of black unions was a huge victory for workers in the apartheid era. As trade unions grew and flourished, so too did the debate about the nature and the role of the labor movement in a society that has been torn asunder by racial oppression. Not only were black workers exploited as workers in the factories and on the mines and farms, but they and their families suffered the indignity of racial discrimination where they lived, in the travel transportation that they used, such as buses, where their children went to school, where they had leisure moments in sports field, and indeed in all areas of life. There were debates within the labor movement on whether unions should be focused